Was making butter tarts when she knocked. That is the detail I keep coming back to. The way my hands were sticky with pastry dough, the way the kitchen smelled like brown sugar and a little bit of vanilla, the way the afternoon light was coming through the window above the sink in that particular November way, low and pale, like it had somewhere else to be. I was pressing the dough into the tart cups and I was thinking about nothing more complicated than whether I had enough pecans. And then there was a knock at my door, and when I opened it, my daughter-in-law was standing on my porch and she was barely standing. Her coat was open. It was -7 and her coat was open and she was not wearing gloves and her left hand was pressed against her stomach in the way that women do when they are protecting something they cannot yet afford to lose. I said her name. Vivian. She looked up at me and I could see that she had been crying for a long time. The kind of crying that leaves your face swollen and strange, and she opened her mouth and what came out first was not words. It was just a sound, small and caught. I pulled her inside. I sat her at the kitchen table, the one my husband Kenneth built 31 years ago from reclaimed barnwood, the one where my son Theo did his homework every night for 12 years. The one where we ate 10,000 meals and argued and laughed and sometimes just sat in silence because silence between people who love each other does not need to be filled. I wrapped a dish towel around her hands because it was what I had. I put the kettle on. She said, "I'm sorry to come here like this." I said, "Don't you dare finish that sentence." She almost smiled. Almost. I had known Vivian for 4 years. My son Theo brought her home to Peterborough for Thanksgiving in 2022, which in our family meant she had cleared some kind of bar he had never made explicit, but that we all understood existed. He was 34 years old and cautious in the way that careful people are careful. Not from fear exactly, but from having thought things through. He did not bring people home. He brought Vivienne. She was a nurse. She worked at the hospital in Hamilton, and she had a way of listening to people that was not performative. Not the kind of listening that is actually waiting for your turn to speak. She listened like she intended to remember. I noticed it the first night. I liked her immediately, which I suppose is its own kind of data point about who she was. They got married the following spring in a small ceremony at the conservation area outside town. 40 people. Wildflowers. Theo cried during the vows and tried to pretend he wasn't crying, and Vivian touched his face and he stopped trying to pretend. My daughter, Diane, was there. I need to tell you about Diane, because you cannot understand what happened without understanding her first. Diane is my eldest. She is 3 years older than Theo, which makes her 38, and she has been the kind of person who catalogues grievances the way other people collect recipes, carefully, with an eye toward future use. She was a difficult child not because she was unkind, but because she needed to be at the center of things, and when she was not at the center of things, she manufactured a reason to be. My husband Kenneth used to say that Diane could find a slight in a compliment, and she could find an audience for it too, and he said it, without cruelty, the way you observe something true about someone you love and have made your peace with. After Kenneth died, 6 years ago now, a heart attack in the driveway in October, the kind of death that gives you no time to prepare and no softening afterward, Diane changed in ways that I told myself were grief. I gave her enormous latitude. I gave her years of it, but grief does not explain everything, and I have learned, slowly and at some cost, that I was confusing grief with something older and more fixed in her. At the wedding, she sat at the head table and smiled and gave a toast that was technically generous and somehow also about her. Vivienne told me afterward that Diane had pulled her aside before the ceremony and said, "You know he almost didn't go through with this." And when Vivienne asked what she meant, Diane had just smiled and said, "I just want you to know what you're walking into." Vivienne had not told Theo. She did not want to start their marriage with that conversation on that day. She filed it away. She should have told me then. I should have known then. But we are always reconstructing the timeline after the fact, finding the moments we missed, and there is no use in it except as a record. In October of last year, Vivian became pregnant. She was 11 weeks along when she told me. She came for Sunday dinner and helped me make roasted chicken, and we were washing vegetables at the sink, and she said, "I wanted you to know before we tell anyone else." She said it quietly, with her eyes on the carrots, And I put down what I was holding and I turned and I looked at her and I said, "Anyone else meaning Diane too?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Okay." I said, "Whenever you're ready." I said, "This is your news to give when and how you choose it." She leaned her head on my shoulder for a moment. Just a moment. Then she picked up the peeler and went back to the carrots. They decided to wait until after the first trimester. Theo told his sister 2 days after they told me, on a Thursday evening by phone. He called me afterward and said it went fine. She seemed happy, but there was something in his voice that was doing a lot of work to sound neutral. I asked if she had said anything that concerned him. He paused. He said, "She asked if it was planned." I let that sit between us for a moment. He said, "I told her yes, obviously." She said she just asked because of how long it had taken. I told him that was not a normal question to ask your brother when he tells you his wife is pregnant, and he said, "I know, Mom, I know." The following Saturday, Vivienne was home alone. Theo was in Toronto for a work thing, a 2-day conference, the kind of thing that requires hotel rooms and bad convention center coffee. Vivienne was off shift, 13 weeks pregnant, tired in the particular way of early pregnancy that is not like other tiredness, and she had planned to spend the day doing nothing useful. Diane showed up at their door at 11 in the morning. Vivienne let her in because Vivienne is a person who lets people in. That is one of the finest things about her, and it is also what Diane counted on. She said she wanted to talk. She said she felt like she and Vivienne had never really had a chance to get close, and she wanted to change that. She said she had brought coffee, which she had, 2 cups from the Tim Hortons down the street, and Vivienne thought, all right, maybe this is the turn. Maybe this is the moment Diane decides to stop being the way she has been. They sat at Vivienne and Theo's kitchen table. For 20 minutes it was fine. Diane asked about the pregnancy, about how Vivienne was feeling, whether they had names in mind. She was warm. She was the version of herself that I know she can be when she chooses it. And Vivienne, who is not naive, allowed herself to relax a little. Because 13 weeks pregnant and tired and wanting things to be uncomplicated is not the same as being foolish. Then Diane set down her coffee cup. She said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." Vivienne said, "Okay." Diane said, "Do you ever feel like this family is harder to be part of than Theo let on?" Vivienne said she wasn't sure what she meant. Diane said, "I just mean you came from a different background. Different values. My mom loves you, I know she does, but she's protective of Theo, and I sometimes wonder if you know what you actually stepped into. I sometimes wonder if she's told you things that she hasn't told me." Vivienne said, "I'm not sure this is a helpful conversation." And that is when Diane changed. Not slowly. It was immediate, the way weather can change in Ontario in November. One moment overcast, the next something else entirely. She said, "I know you've been working on her. I know what you're doing. You show up every Sunday with your little dish towels and your listening face, and you're doing it deliberately, and we all see it." Vivienne stood up and asked her to leave. Diane said, "You think this baby makes you permanent. You think it makes you one of us. You're not. You have never been. And my mother will figure that out eventually, and when she does, I want you to think back to this conversation." Vivienne walked to the front door and opened it. She said, "Please go." Diane walked toward her, and there was something in the way she moved, something that Vivienne said later was not like a person walking out a door, but like a person deciding to fill a space. She stepped close to Vivienne, close enough that Vivienne stepped back, and she said something that I will not repeat here because I have made a decision not to give it more air than it has already had. And then she shoved Vivienne hard, with both hands. And Vivienne stumbled backward into the hallway wall, and then Diane shoved her again, and Vivienne went down. She fell against the edge of the bottom stair and then down to the hardwood floor of the entryway. Diane stepped over her. She said, "Call it an accident if you want. That's probably easiest." Then she left. Vivienne lay on the floor for a moment. She said later that her first thought was not about herself. It was about whether the fall had been the kind that ends things or the kind that doesn't, and that she did not know, and that not knowing was the worst feeling she had ever had. She lay there and she pressed her hand to her stomach and she counted. She stayed very still and she counted and she waited. Then she got up. She did not call Theo. She said she did not want to hear his voice and have to tell him over the phone. She did not call 911 because she was upright, and the cramps that she was waiting for did not come, and she made the calculation that a nurse makes, which is not always the same calculation that a patient makes. She drove herself to the hospital. I do not think this was the right decision, and I told her so later, gently, and she said, "I know, I just needed to be in a building where people knew what to do." She sat in the emergency waiting area for 3 hours. The cramping did not come. Her blood pressure was elevated. They did an ultrasound at hour 2, and the baby, my granddaughter, though I did not know that word yet, was fine. Heartbeat strong, position good. Fine. Then she called me. She said, "I need to come to yours." I said, "I'll put the kettle on." That is when I was making the butter tarts. I listened to all of it without interrupting. I am not a person who is good at sitting still when someone I love is in pain, but I have learned over 64 years of being alive and 36 years of being a mother that sometimes the most useful thing you can do is simply bear witness. So I sat across from her at Kenneth's table, and I held her hands and I listened. When she finished, I asked her 2 questions. I said, "Is the baby safe?" She said yes. I said, "Did Theo know where Diane was this morning?" She said, "I don't think so. I don't think he knew she was coming." I said, Okay. Then I said, "I need you to go upstairs and lie down in the guest room, and I need you to let me handle what comes next." She started to say something about not wanting to cause trouble, and I said, "Vivienne, listen to me carefully. You did not cause this. You have never caused this. You have never caused this. And what happens now is not your responsibility to manage." She went upstairs. I called Theo. He picked up on the second ring, and I said, "I need you to come home from Toronto. Tonight. Don't ask me details over the phone. Just come home and come to my house first, not yours." He said, "Mom, what happened?" I said, "Vivienne is safe. The baby is safe. Come home." There was a silence on the line that I recognized. It was the silence of a person recalibrating. He said, "Is this about Diane?" It was not a question. He arrived at my door at 9:30 that night. Vivienne had slept for 3 hours and come downstairs, and we had eaten soup, which was all either of us wanted, and she had told me more, smaller details, the way Diane's voice had sounded, the particular words, the fact that she had not seemed afraid of being caught because it had not occurred to her that there would be consequences. That detail stayed with me. I told Theo everything while Vivienne sat beside him and held his hand. I watched him in the way that mothers watch their children when children are processing something that is going to change them. His face went through several things. At the end, he was very still. He said, "I'm going to call her." I said, "Not tonight." He said, "Mum." I said, "Theo, not tonight. Tonight you are going to stay here with your wife and your daughter, and tomorrow morning we are going to think clearly. Anger is allowed, but it does not plan well." He stayed. I called my brother Douglas that night after they had gone to bed in the guest room. Douglas is 71 and retired from the RCMP, and he is the person I call when I need to understand what things actually mean from a legal standpoint, not just an emotional one. I told him what happened. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "A person entered another person's home and committed a physical assault against a pregnant woman that resulted in a fall and documented hospital visit." He said it the way he used to say things when he was still on the job. Organized, stripped of feeling, just the facts arranged in sequence. He said, "That is not a family matter, Eleanor. That is an assault." I said, "What are the options?" He said, "She can file a police report. Given the circumstances, the pregnancy, the hospital documentation, the nature of the threat, there is a reasonable likelihood that charges would proceed." He said, "There would also be grounds for a civil restraining order." I said, "What would you do?" He said, "I would make sure she had every option in front of her, and I would not pressure her either way, but I know which one I would choose." I said, "So do I." The next morning, I made pancakes. This might seem beside the point, but it was not. Theo and Vivienne came downstairs, and I had made pancakes and orange juice, and I had set the table properly, placemats and everything, because I believe that sitting down to a real breakfast before a hard conversation is not a luxury. It is a kind of preparation. It tells your body that you are grounded. It tells your body that you are not alone. We ate. Then I laid out what Douglas had told me. Vivienne listened. She was quiet for a long time after. She said, "I don't want to make this worse for Theo." Theo said, "Vivienne, look at me." She looked at him. He said, "You are not making anything worse. What was done to you was done to both of us. Whatever you decide, I am beside you." She decided to file the report. A constable came to my house that afternoon. Vivienne gave her statement at the kitchen table, the same table. I sat beside her and Douglas was on the phone in case there were questions about process, though there weren't. The constable was thorough and kind and seemed to understand the situation without needing it explained twice. Charges were laid 2 weeks later. Assault causing bodily harm given the pregnancy and the documented fall. It did not go to trial. Diane's lawyer recommended she not take that chance, and she did not. She pled. She received a conditional discharge, 2 years probation, mandatory anger management, and a no-contact order covering Vivienne, Theo, and the baby. I know that some people will say that is not enough. I understand that. I have had that thought myself, in the middle of the night, in the specific way of middle-of-the-night thoughts that are not interested in proportionality. But I am also 64 years old, and I have learned that the law is not always about punishment in the way we want it to be. The no-contact order is real. The record is real. The thing that Diane spent her whole life believing, that there would be no consequences, that family meant immunity, that is gone now. That is real too. I called Diane myself. Once, a week after the plea, before the no-contact order was finalized, and while I still legally could. She picked up and said, "Hello, Mom," as though nothing had happened, and the normality of it was so staggering that for a moment I couldn't speak. Then I said, "I want to say one thing, and then I'm going to hang up. What you did to Vivienne was unforgivable, not because I am incapable of forgiveness, but because you have not asked for it and you do not believe you need it. You went into her home and you put your hands on her while she was carrying my grandchild, and you told her she didn't belong in this family. I am telling you now that you are wrong. She belongs. She has always belonged. And you are the one who chose to leave." Then I hung up. I have not spoken to Diane since. She sent me an email in January that I read once and did not respond to. She called on my birthday in March and I let it go to voicemail. The message was 4 minutes long and I deleted it without listening past the first 30 seconds, which was her telling me I was being dramatic. I do not think I am being dramatic. I think I am being precise. Vivienne's due date is late June. We have painted the second bedroom in Theo and Vivienne's house a colour called Morning Haze, which is a sort of soft blue-grey, and I built the crib with Theo on a Saturday in April, while Vivienne supervised and told us we were doing it wrong, which we were. We had Thai food after. It was a good day. I think about Kenneth sometimes in all of this. I think about what he would have said, which is hard to know exactly because he was a quiet man who thought before he spoke, and sometimes what he thought stayed with him. But I know he loved Vivienne. I know he would have stood at that kitchen door in November, and he would have seen what I saw, and he would have done what needed to be done in the quiet and determined way that he did things. I make butter tarts most Sundays now. It started as an accident. Just what I happened to be baking when everything began, and now it has become something else. Vivienne asked me once why I always make them, and I said, "I'm not sure. Habit, maybe." She said she thought it might be something else. I said, "Maybe." She smiled. There is a particular thing that happens in a kitchen when people love each other. It is not complicated. Someone chops and someone stirs and someone stands at the window watching the snow and no one is performing anything for anyone else. It is just people in a room together, making something ordinary, and the ordinariness of it is not small. The ordinariness is the point. You do not rebuild a family by making grand gestures. You do not fix what was broken by announcing that it is fixed. You do it Sunday by Sunday, recipe by recipe, with your hands in the dough and the kettle on and the door open for the people who deserve to walk through it. My granddaughter will be born in June. She will sit at this table eventually. She will press her small hands into dough someday, and she will not know what the table cost, not really, and that is exactly how it should be. That is the whole story. That is all of it. I have been thinking about what it actually takes to do the right thing when the right thing is hard and inconvenient and involves someone you raised. It is not a single decision. It is 100 small ones made in sequence, and most of them do not feel heroic in the moment. They feel like sitting in a cold hallway with a dish towel. They feel like listening without interrupting. They feel like calling your brother at 10 at night and asking him what the law actually says, because you want to be sure before you move. What I watched Vivienne do in those weeks, drive herself to the hospital when she was frightened, sit at my table and tell me the truth, even when the truth was humiliating in the way that being a victim is always humiliating. Agree to file a report when part of her wanted to keep the peace. That was not weakness. That was a kind of moral clarity that most people spend their whole lives talking about, and very few actually demonstrate when it costs something. She knew what had been done to her was wrong. She said so. She acted on it. That takes more than most people understand. And Theo, I have watched my son his whole life. I know where he is careful and where he is not. That night, he sat across from Vivienne and said, "Whatever you decide, I am beside you." That was not a small thing. That was a man who had thought through what it meant to be married to someone, what it actually meant beyond the ceremony and the wildflowers, and arrived at a place of genuine commitment. You do not get there by accident. You get there by paying attention and by choosing, repeatedly, to be the kind of person who shows up. I think about cause and effect a great deal now. I think about the chain of choices that brought us to that November afternoon. Diane's choices, years of them, each one a small permission granted to herself to behave as though other people's pain was not her concern. No single moment broke our family. It was a long accumulation. And the ending, such as it is, was also an accumulation of Vivienne's willingness to speak, Theo's willingness to stand still and listen, Douglas's steady voice on the phone, my own decision to make pancakes in the morning and lay out the facts without drama. The thing I come back to is this: the people who caused harm in this story did not lack intelligence. Diane is not a foolish person. She lacked the willingness to look at herself honestly, and she lacked the persistence to do the quiet work of being decent when no one was watching and there was nothing to gain. Those two things together, the honesty and the persistence, they matter more than I think we say out loud. I made butter tarts again last Sunday. Vivienne sat at the table and watched me, and eventually she got up and stood beside me, and I showed her how to press the dough, just so, not too hard, just enough. She is a quick learner. She always has been. The kitchen smelled like brown sugar and vanilla, and outside the June light was coming through the window, and somewhere in the next room her daughter was sleeping, and everything that had been broken was not unbroken. Some things do not unbreak, but it was bearable, more than bearable. That, I think, is what you work toward, not the absence of damage, but the ability to stand in your own kitchen in the June light and press your hands into something soft and know that you did not look away when it mattered.